On the night of celebration, when candles glowed and voices rose in laughter, he stood in the doorway and heard the words that cut deeper than any blade. "That's not your seat anymore." For a moment, he thought he had misheard. His seat, the head of the table, the place from which he had once blessed meals, settled quarrels, and spoken words of guidance, was already occupied. His son sat there now, shoulders squared, chin lifted as though he had always belonged in that chair. Plates clattered, wine poured, and not a single head turned to notice the man who had built the very table they feasted upon. He stood still, framed by the light of the room, waiting for one of them, any of them, to rise, to gesture, to say, "Father, please, this is yours." But no words came. They carried on without him, laughter spilling into the corners of the house, dismissing his presence as if it were no longer necessary. A guest in his own home, an intruder at his own table. Memories rushed unbidden, his hands cracked and raw from years of labor, laying the foundation stones of the house. His back bent under burdens so his children could walk tall. His sacrifices, quiet and uncelebrated, had shaped every life seated before him. Yet here, in the glow of festivity, he was invisible. The room felt colder despite the fire in the hearth, colder despite the warmth of food and wine. He lowered his eyes to hide the storm that brewed inside him, because he knew that a single outburst would be twisted into proof of his irrelevance. But silence was heavier than fury. He walked past the table, no one shifting, no one offering space, as though his presence were merely a shadow. He sat at the corner on a chair too small, too low, far from the laughter, as if placed deliberately to remind him he was no longer at the center. His son's voice boomed across the room, confident, self-sure, claiming authority over traditions that had never been his to claim. Guests raised glasses, echoing words that sounded like ownership, like dismissal of everything that came before. The old man clenched his hands on his knees, forcing himself not to tremble, not from weakness, but from the weight of betrayal. For years he had imagined this chair, this table, this home would carry his legacy forward. But instead it carried only his absence. His chair was gone, his voice silenced, his name unspoken. He was still alive, yet they buried him in silence. And as laughter rose around him, he felt something shift inside. Not despair, not rage, but a seed of resolve. For if they could take his seat without asking, then they had forgotten who he truly was. They had mistaken silence for surrender. They had mistaken humility for weakness. What they did not know, and what he would never remind them in words, was that the chair was not just a piece of furniture, and the table was not just wood. It was all his. The house was his. And one day soon, without warning, he would take it back. Friends, let's take a short pause. Please write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever faced something similar in your own life? Don't forget to subscribe, share this video, and ring the bell. Your support helps us grow this channel. And now, let's continue. He entered the room expecting, at the very least, the weight of tradition to hold its place. But as he stood by the doorway, the scene unfolded like a cruel play. No one rose. No one hesitated. No one acknowledged the emptiness of the gesture that should have been his. Plates shifted, glasses rang together, forks clicked against porcelain, and laughter swirled like music to everyone but him. The chair at the head, the chair that had once been the throne of his quiet authority, was filled by another, and its absence beneath him left an emptiness inside that grew heavier with every passing second. He took a smaller seat at the edge of the table, forced into the shadows of his own home. The fabric of humiliation tightened around him like a noose. He had once been the center of every gathering, the man who prayed before meals, who carved the meat with steady hands, who steadied trembling voices when disputes arose. His chair was the anchor of the room, the symbol of the house's foundation, and now, with no word, no protest, they erased him, reducing his presence to something unimportant, disposable, almost laughable. Their voices lifted louder as if to drown him out, the rhythm of their conversation dancing over him like waves crashing against stone. His son bragged about decisions made, his daughter-in-law played hostess with a pride that did not belong to her, and his grandson's laughter cut like a knife, each chuckle at some trivial joke pressing deeper into the old man's silence. He sat still, not because he felt weak, but because he knew his voice would not be welcomed. His silence, however, grew louder than words. It pressed against the air, even if no one admitted to hearing it. Inside, something cracked. Not a violent break, not a sound others could hear, but a silent fracture that split years of patience, years of sacrifice, years of believing his family would honor him as their root, their guide. He had carried them, all of them, through storms they had long forgotten. He had fed them when food was scarce, clothed them when money was thin, and held them upright when life had tried to pull them down. And yet here, in the glow of abundance, they cast him aside like a shadow too long stretched across the floor. The humiliation did not burn, it froze. It spread through him like ice, reminding him with chilling clarity that in their eyes his worth had expired. They mistook his aging hands for weakness, his softened voice for irrelevance, his silence for surrender. They had not only taken his chair, they had taken his place in the story of the family, rewriting it without his name. But in that coldness, in that quiet humiliation, something stirred, the first spark of justice unspoken, the knowledge that while they could steal a seat at a table, they could never steal the foundation of the house itself. The whispers reached him like daggers hidden beneath laughter. They did not speak them loudly, but loud enough for him to hear, loud enough for the poison to sink deep. He's old now. He doesn't decide anymore. The words did not just bruise, they carved, they erased. It was not a casual remark, it was a verdict. A declaration that the man who had raised them, who had given everything to shape their lives, no longer had a voice in the house his hands had built. He sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the flicker of a candle, but inside the fire roared, pressing against his chest until it almost suffocated him. He saw their smirks, subtle and sharp, traded like secrets across the table. The son, swelling with pride as though authority had passed to him by right rather than by sacrifice. The daughter-in-law, hiding her satisfaction behind a thin smile, a queen in a kingdom she never bled to build. The grandson, laughing carelessly, not yet old enough to understand the cruelty and mocking the very tree whose roots had given him shade. They did not see him as the foundation anymore. They saw him as an ornament, a relic of a past they believed no longer mattered. Every chuckle, every careless remark, stripped away another layer of dignity they had once given freely. He had taught them respect, yet they returned mockery. He had taught them gratitude, yet they repaid him with dismissal. He had taught them honor, yet they buried him alive in their arrogance. The betrayal was not in the words alone, it was in the forgetting. They had forgotten the hunger he endured to keep bread on their plates, the winters he braved with torn shoes so theirs would be warm, the nights he worked in silence while they dreamed without fear. All of it, erased in one evening of whispers and smirks. He sat still, but not broken. His silence weighed heavier than their careless words, heavier than their stolen laughter. They thought him powerless, irrelevant, forgotten, but deep inside, he knew what they had never bothered to learn, that true power does not need to shout. True power does not need to be seen at every moment. It waits, it endures, it remembers, and one day, without warning, it rises. He sat in the shadowed corner, his plate untouched, and as the noise of laughter filled the room, His mind slipped away into places no one at that table cared to remember. Memories rose unbidden, heavy and sharp, flooding over him like waves he could not stop. Nights when the house was nothing but timber and dust, and he alone worked beneath the flicker of a lantern, his body aching, his hands cracked open and bleeding, yet refusing to stop. Winters when the walls were thin and the cold seeped through, and he had given his own coat to his son so the boy might sleep without shivering. Summers when hunger stalked the family, and he went without food so that his children could eat. He remembered standing at the bank, papers in trembling hands, begging for a loan with nothing but his labor to guarantee it, swearing to repay what seemed impossible. And he had repaid it, every cent, with sweat wrung from his body, with time stolen from sleep, with years given away to toil. No one saw those hours, no one praised them, but those hours lived in the walls around them, in the roof that kept out storms, in the table they now filled with their careless laughter. They thought comfort had always been theirs, when in truth it had been wrestled out of hardship by his bare hands. The faces around the table glowed with ease, with entitlement, with the belief that this warmth, this safety, this abundance was their natural right. Not one of them thought of the man who had carried the weight of their survival when survival itself was a daily battle. Not one of them wondered what it had cost to turn scarcity into plenty. They had taken it all as inheritance, not sacrifice. They had mistaken his silence for irrelevance, forgetting that it was his silence that had built the life they now squandered. He stared at them, his chest heavy, not with anger, but with something deeper, an ache sharper than betrayal. He did not envy their laughter. He did not covet their place. What pierced him was their blindness, their refusal to see that everything they enjoyed was stained with his sweat. The walls that sheltered them bore the imprint of his hands. The floor that carried their footsteps had been set by his labor. The very air of peace they breathed had been bought by his sacrifices. And yet they looked at him as though he were an afterthought, a shadow in the corner, a man whose story no longer mattered. But he knew. He remembered. And memory itself was power. For while they might laugh and dismiss, while they might erase and forget, the truth of what he had given could not be destroyed. The roof above their heads still whispered his name. The beams, the bricks, the foundations, every one of them told a story they refused to hear. But one day, they would. His son's voice cut through the room like a blade, not in volume alone, but in arrogance. He spoke as though he were already king of a kingdom built by his own hand, as though the bricks had risen from the ground at his command. "My house," he declared, lifting his glass high, "my future, my plans." The words struck harder than any insult, harder than the whispers, harder than the smirks, for in that moment the father's name, his life's labor, his sacrifices, were erased with a single careless phrase. The man who had built the walls, who had bent beneath their weight, who had poured his soul into every corner of the house, was cut out of the story like he had never existed. His knuckles tightened against his lap, the veins in his hands rising as though his body alone carried the weight of all he wished to say but would not. He could not bring himself to answer. What words could fight against arrogance so blind? The room roared with approval at the son's ambition. Glasses clinked, guests nodded, and pride swelled in their voices as they spoke of his future. But the father sat silent, knowing that the very roof above their heads would not have existed if not for the nights he had worked with bleeding hands, if not for the years he had carried burdens too heavy for a single man. He remembered the first brick he laid, the first nail he drove, the first winter when the house was nothing but bare walls against the wind. He remembered his wife's trembling hands as she clutched a newborn by the fire, warmth barely enough to shield them, and how he swore that the house would grow, would hold them, would protect them all. And he had kept that vow, one sacrifice at a time, 1 year at a time. Yet here, in the glow of plenty, his son, his own flesh, claimed it as inheritance, not legacy, ownership, not gratitude. It was not only the words that wounded, but the ease with which they were spoken, the laughter that followed, the careless assumption that the future had already shifted into younger hands. They thought the old man's silence was surrender, that his age meant he had nothing left to give, nothing left to claim. But beneath his quiet stillness, the storm gathered, for he knew truths they had forgotten, truths written not in wine-soaked boasts, but in ink and paper, in deeds and signatures that could never be erased. He looked at his son then, not with hatred, not even with sorrow, but with the steady gaze of a man who knew a secret, a man who understood that arrogance has its season, but truth, sooner or later, reclaims its place. They had taken his seat without asking. They had stolen his name from their stories. They had buried him while he still breathed. But what they did not know was that the house was still his, and that his silence was not defeat. It was patience. It was waiting. And when the moment came, his silence would speak louder than all their voices combined. She moved through the room with the elegance of someone convinced the house itself bowed to her presence. The wine flowed from her hand into the guests' glasses, her smile polished and proud, as though she were the mistress of an estate built on her vision, her effort, her triumph. Every gesture carried ownership, every nod to the guests whispered of authority, and yet not one drop of sweat had ever stained her brow for the walls that surrounded them. She poured with pride, but the pride was borrowed. She smiled, but the smile was stolen. He watched her from the corner, his eyes heavy but sharp, taking in every movement. The way she leaned close to visitors, speaking of our home with the ease of someone who had never known the nights of hunger, the winters of cold, the days when nothing stood here but broken earth. She paraded through the hall as though the foundation itself bore her name, forgetting, or perhaps never caring, that another man's hands had signed, had built, had bled for every stone and beam that now embraced her in comfort. The betrayal was not in her voice, nor even in her confidence, but in her forgetting that once, before the polished wood, before the curtains, before the grand table laden with food, this house had been only a dream he carried on his shoulders alone. She had entered it ready-made, its rooms warm, its walls strong, its floor firm beneath her feet, and rather than honor the one who had carved it out of struggle, she erased him with a smile, effortlessly, carelessly, as if his name were dust swept out with the ashes. Her pride grew with each laugh of the guests, with every approving glance, with every glass raised in her direction. They saw her as hostess, guardian, lady of the house. He saw her as a thief, not of walls, but of memory. She wore the crown of his labor without ever having borne the weight of it, and in doing so, she denied him his place. The old man's heart did not beat with rage. It beat with a sorrow deeper than anger could ever reach. For what hurt him most was not her arrogance, but the ease with which everyone else accepted it. His son at the head of the table, his grandson laughing at his side, the guests clapping at her charm. Together, they had all agreed to erase him. Their silence, their applause, their smiles were accomplices to the crime of forgetting. But he remembered. He remembered the long years when no one else believed in the house, when it was only wood and stone and a promise he carried. He remembered the nights when storms clawed at the roof and he stood alone, pressing against the wind to keep it from breaking apart. He remembered carrying debts heavier than his own body, debts he paid in full with sweat, while others slept warm under blankets. And now that same house bore her laughter, her triumph, her false crown. He sat still, eyes lowered so they would not see the fire beneath them. They thought he had become too old to care, too quiet to matter. But they were blind to the truth. The crown she wore was not hers to keep, and the foundation she ignored carried only his name. And one day, whether they wished it or not, the house itself would speak for him. The cough slipped from his chest, unplanned, a small reminder that his body carried years heavier than the laughter around the table could ever understand. But the sound did not bring concern, nor a hand stretched in care. Instead, it brought mockery. The grandson's voice, young and sharp, cut the air with cruelty that came too easily. He doesn't belong at the head anymore. The words were thrown like a stone into still water, and the ripples of laughter followed, spreading through the table as if mockery itself were a shared meal. Glasses clinked, voices rose, and they laughed, not only at his cough, not only at his age, but at his very existence. He sat frozen, the echo of that laughter digging deeper than the words themselves. This was the grandson he had once carried on his shoulders, when the boy's legs were too small to reach the path. The same boy whose fever he had prayed through in long nights, whispering promises that he would grow strong, that he would live to see the fullness of life. That boy, now grown, now healthy, now seated in warmth and abundance, laughed at the very hands that had steadied his first steps. The others did not silence him. No one stopped the laughter. His son, the boy's father, smirked as though he agreed. The daughter-in-law hid her grin behind a napkin. Guests chuckled, their eyes sliding away, unwilling to confront the cruelty but eager to join its ease. Together they built a wall of humiliation, brick by brick, with their laughter as mortar. And he, the man who had once been the foundation of everything they knew, was left standing outside of it, dismissed, erased, turned into a relic unworthy of respect. Age, they thought, was weakness. Age, they thought, was failure. They did not see that his years were the reason they sat there at all, that every line on his face had been carved by nights of sacrifice they would never comprehend. They mocked the weight of his cough, forgetting that the weight of his years had carried them all through hunger, through cold, through despair. Without those years, without those burdens, they would not have had the comfort to sit so arrogantly and laugh. The old man lowered his gaze, not to hide shame, there was none, but to steady the storm rising within him. Their laughter rolled like thunder in his ears, cruel and careless, but it did not crush him, it hardened him. For with every laugh, every smirk, every stolen shred of dignity, they unknowingly pushed him closer to the moment they feared most, the moment when silence would end and truth would speak. They thought they were mocking weakness. What they were mocking was patience, and patience, when it breaks, is stronger than any arrogance at the table. That night, the house was quiet, emptied of its laughter, but the echoes of their mockery still clung to him like smoke. He closed his door slowly, the noise of the feast muffled behind walls that he had raised with his own hands. He did not rage. Rage was too small for what he felt. He did not weep. Tears would only give the night a victory it did not deserve. Instead, he sat in the stillness, his body heavy with years, his heart heavier with memory. And then, almost without thought, his hand reached for the old drawer he had not opened in so long. It creaked, as though even wood remembered its age, but inside lay the truth, undisturbed, patient, waiting. Folders thick with documents, papers untouched for years, yet alive with quiet power. He pulled them out one by one, his roughened fingers brushing against signatures inked in his own hand, the name that bound every wall, every room, every inch of land to him. Title deeds, ownership papers, contracts marked with seals that did not fade, no matter how much they tried to erase him with laughter. They had forgotten, but paper does not forget. His children had erased his place in their minds, but ink could not be mocked. His grandson had laughed at his cough, but his name was written into foundations laughter could not shake. His daughter-in-law had worn the house like a crown, but the crown belonged to the name on those pages, the man they had dismissed into silence. He sat there, The paper spread across the table like a silent army. He had no need for fury, no need for words thrown into the wind. The documents spoke louder than any voice he could raise. They held within them years of sacrifice, the weight of his work, the proof of his dignity. They were not just ink and paper. They were justice waiting, patient and absolute. The candle by his side flickered, its flame bending low, and he leaned closer, reading every line as though reclaiming himself, piece by piece. Every deed carried memory. The first plot of land, bought with coins scraped together from years of labor. The loan he had signed with trembling hands. A promise kept with sweat and sleepless nights. The final signature, pressed firm and steady, declaring that the house was his, not theirs, not borrowed, not inherited, but earned. And as he sat in the quiet, the humiliation of the evening hardened into something sharper, cleaner. Not anger, not sorrow, but resolve. They could laugh, they could sneer, they could forget, but the house had not forgotten. The walls knew, the floors knew, the papers knew, and when the time came, he would no longer sit silent in a shadowed corner. When the time came, they would remember, not through his words, but through the unshakable truth that had waited patiently in a drawer, sealed by his hand. He closed the drawer gently, the papers now resting in his lap, his fingers still gripping the weight of them. Outside, the house slept, unaware that its master was awake, reclaiming his voice in silence. They thought they had taken his seat without asking. They thought they had buried him in their arrogance. But tonight, alone in his room, he knew the truth. The seed of justice had been planted, and soon, without warning, it would grow. Days began to move with a different rhythm, not marked by their laughter, but by his quiet steps beyond the house. He did not confront, did not announce, did not warn. He rose each morning with a calm face, a bowed head, the image of an old man resigned to the corner. But when the door closed behind him, he walked with purpose. His steps carried him not to markets or gardens, but to offices where respect still remembered his name. Behind polished desks and heavy doors, men in suits straightened when he entered. Lawyers greeted him not with pity, but with firm handshakes, voices steady, eyes recognizing the authority in the papers he carried. They did not see an old man. They saw the signature that had shaped contracts, the deeds that still bore weight, the foundation of ownership too strong to be questioned. In hushed rooms, he laid out documents like quiet weapons, each line of ink a reminder that history was not written in whispers at a dinner table, but in the permanence of law. Officials nodded as they read, their approval measured but certain. Yes, their eyes seemed to say, this remains yours. Not by memory alone, not by sentiment, but by proof that had never faded. Every stamp, every seal, every line of legal recognition reinforced what the family had chosen to forget. The house did not belong to them. It belonged to him. And while he moved through corridors of authority, his family remained blind. They feasted unaware. They poured wine, raised glasses, spoke of futures that were not theirs to command. The son planned expansions as if the house were already his empire. The daughter-in-law entertained guests as if her crown were secure. The grandson mocked shadows, still ignorant of the storm that had already begun to gather above their heads. They laughed, they smirked, they dismissed him, not knowing that every careless word they spoke was feeding the silence that would soon rise against them. In the quiet of these days, he said little. His silence had become his shield and his weapon. At home he carried himself as before, patient, almost invisible, giving no sign of the fire building beneath the surface. They mistook his calmness for surrender, blind to the truth that patience is not weakness. Patience is preparation. At night he returned to his room, the documents safely folded back into their place, his heart steady, his resolve sharper. The papers whispered to him in the stillness, "They have forgotten, but we have not. He listened, he believed, and he waited. Each day that passed brought him closer to the moment when truth would step out from drawers and offices into the center of the house, unannounced, undeniable, unerasable. The storm did not roar yet, it gathered. But he knew storms need no warning. They only need time. The night of their gathering arrived, and this time no one even knocked on his door. No one called his name. They filled the house with guests and music, but not with him. He was not invited. His absence was not accident, but decision, and that truth pressed heavier on his chest than any cold wind could. Still, as evening fell, he stepped quietly outside, drawn not by hope, but by a pull he could not resist. He walked across the yard, where his footsteps had once carried timber and stone, where his sweat had once soaked the soil, and he stopped beneath the shadow of the house he had built brick by brick. Through the windows glowed the warmth of firelight, spilling golden laughter onto the night. Shadows moved behind curtains, arms raised in toasts, voices bursting with cheer. They celebrated in abundance, blind to the man standing outside, the man who had laid the first stone and hammered the first nail. He stood in silence, watching the life within those walls, knowing that every glass raised, every song sung, every chair filled was possible only because he had once worked until his bones ached. Yet they celebrated as though he were already gone, as though he had never mattered at all. He remembered carrying sacks heavier than his own strength, breaking his back so that the foundation would hold against storms. He remembered the first winter when the walls trembled, and he pressed his body against them through the night to keep the wind from breaking through. He remembered each repair, each sacrifice, each long hour of labor invisible to those who now drank wine and spoke of their home. They did not invite him, because they did not see him anymore. In their eyes, the house was theirs alone. But as he stood in the darkness, he felt no need to force his way inside. No need to beg for a seat or a plate or a smile. He did not belong at their table anymore, not because he was unworthy, but because their blindness had made them unworthy of him. Let them laugh. Let them fill the air with arrogance. The house might shelter their bodies, but it still carried his name. The walls did not lie. The beams did not forget. The ink on the deeds did not fade. For a moment he closed his eyes, breathing the cold air, listening to their joy echo through the home that would soon remind them who it truly belonged to. He did not rage, he did not weep. He only stood with the dignity of a man who knew that justice walks slowly, but it never loses its way. Then, turning from the glowing windows, he walked back into the darkness, leaving them to feast in ignorance, while the storm drew nearer, silent and unstoppable. The feast was loud, their laughter spilling into every corner of the house, as though joy itself had been chained to arrogance. Glasses rose again and again, the clinking echoing like victory drums, their pride swelling until it seemed there was no space left for silence. And then it came. A knock, sharp, deliberate, heavy enough to slice through music and mirth. At first they ignored it, too wrapped in themselves. The second knock was louder, insistent, commanding. The room fell quiet, a ripple of unease breaking through the cheer. When the door opened, it was not another guest, not a neighbor, not a friend. It was a man in a dark coat, briefcase in hand, voice measured, eyes steady. A lawyer. He did not wait for permission, did not bow to their shock. He stepped into the warmth as though the house itself recognized his authority. Papers emerged from his case, neatly folded, stamped, undeniable. He laid them on the polished table, already cluttered with wine and bread, the inked words heavier than gold, heavier than pride. And then, without hesitation, he spoke the truth they had buried beneath their laughter. This property is not yours. It was never yours. It belongs to him. The words fell like a gavel, striking harder than any judge's hammer. Forks slipped from fingers and clattered against plates. A glass shattered against the floor. the red wine spreading like spilled blood. The son's voice died in his throat, his arrogance cut short. The daughter-in-law's smile drained from her face, leaving behind only pale disbelief. The grandson froze, his laughter strangled, his eyes wide with shame he could not yet name. The guests shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, realizing they had been dining on pride that was not theirs to consume. Silence swelled, thick and suffocating. Every word the lawyer read echoed against the walls, and those walls seemed to listen, to breathe, to testify. The papers bore signatures, deeds, seals that no arrogance could erase. The house itself seemed to lean closer, as though it had been waiting for this moment, waiting to remind them of the name etched into its foundation. The old man had not yet stepped inside, but his presence filled the room more than all of them combined. They felt him in the ink, in the documents that glared back at them with unarguable truth. For all their boasting, for all their claims, they had no ground to stand on. The ground beneath their feet was his, and it had never stopped being his. Their feast turned sour, their pride crumbled into dust, and shame settled on the table heavier than any meal. No one dared to laugh now. No one dared to smirk. The storm had arrived, not with thunder, not with shouting, but with a knock, a voice, and the undeniable truth of paper that never forgets. The silence after the lawyer's words was unlike any silence they had ever known. It was not peace, not rest, but the heavy stillness of shame descending like a curtain, smothering every voice that had moments before risen in arrogance. The son, who had spoken so loudly of his house and his future, sat pale as stone, his glass trembling in his hand. His lips moved as though searching for an answer, an excuse, but none came. No words could rise against the weight of truth inked on those papers, truth that carried more authority than all his boasts combined. The daughter-in-law's smile slipped away as if it had never belonged to her at all. She had worn it like a crown, parading through rooms she believed she owned, but now her face was bare, stripped of its mask. Her fingers clutched at the tablecloth as though she could anchor herself in comfort, but even the table seemed to betray her, its wood whispering another man's name. All her laughter, her pride, her practiced elegance collapsed into silence, leaving her exposed not as mistress of the house, but as a pretender draped in borrowed authority. The grandson, who had mocked his grandfather's cough and sneered at his age, lowered his eyes to the floor. He dared not look at the lawyer, dared not look at his father, dared not look at the walls that bore a silent witness. His cheeks burned, not from anger, but from humiliation he had never known before. For the first time he saw what lay beneath his arrogance, that the chair he laughed at, the man he mocked, had carried the very years that now sustained him. His head bent low, and though no apology left his lips, shame spoke louder than words. The house itself seemed to breathe differently, as though every wall, every beam, every stone had been waiting for this moment. The laughter that had once filled its rooms now hung in the air like an echo of betrayal, and in its place came the truth. This was not their house. It never had been. It was built on his hands, his nights of labor, his years of sacrifice. The walls bore his name even if their lips refused to speak it. The roof carried the memory of storms he had endured alone. The floors held the weight of his footsteps long before theirs ever touched them. No one at the table moved. No one dared to lift a glass or speak a word. The feast lay before them untouched, its abundance now tasting of ashes. They had eaten pride, and now they swallowed shame. The very air reminded them that the man they had mocked, dismissed, erased, was the true foundation beneath them all. Their arrogance had collapsed, and in its place a silence heavier than any voice filled the house. And though he had not yet stepped into the room, his presence was everywhere. They could feel him in the weight of the silence, in the truth that surrounded them, in the dignity that had never needed a seat to command respect. He had been erased in their eyes, but the house itself refused to forget him. The house, brick by brick, beam by beam, declared its master without a sound. The door opened softly, yet the sound struck louder than thunder in the stillness. He stepped inside without haste, his posture steady, his steps unbroken, his presence filling the room before his voice ever could. Faces turned toward him, drained of color, mouths open yet unable to speak. Their feast, their arrogance, their laughter, all of it collapsed the moment he crossed the threshold. He did not rage, he did not accuse, he did not even lift his voice. His silence carried more weight than their loudest words had ever held. He walked slowly, his eyes calm, unreadable, as though he had already judged and found them wanting. The son shrank in his chair, his glass forgotten. The daughter-in-law lowered her gaze, her pride broken into shards she could no longer piece together. The grandson trembled, his head bowed in shame. Yet he gave them no scorn, no fury, no vengeance. He let them drown in the silence they had created for themselves. His hand reached for the chair, his chair, the one they had stolen, the one they had tried to erase him from, and he laid his palm on its back with the weight of quiet ownership. The wood seemed to remember him, to breathe again under his touch. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled it back and sat, not with triumph, but with dignity. The head of the table, the heart of the home, had returned to its rightful place. And in that moment, no one dared to question it. The lawyer's papers lay still on the table, but they were no longer needed. His presence alone was proof enough, stronger than ink, stronger than law. He did not gloat, he did not sneer, he did not demand thanks. His very being, steady and unshaken, declared what no arrogance could undo. This house was his, this table was his, this legacy was his. They had tried to bury him in silence, but he had risen higher than their laughter, higher than their betrayal. Around him shame thickened. No one lifted a fork. No one raised a glass. The meal that moments ago had been their triumph now lay heavy with guilt, untouched and unwanted. Their humiliation was the only feast left, and he needed no words to serve it. He sat with calm dignity, the weight of his presence filling every corner of the house, reclaiming not only the chair, but the respect that should never have been lost. And still, he did not rage. For true justice does not come with fury. It comes with truth that cannot be denied. And tonight, truth had taken its seat. He sat at the head of the table once more, not with fanfare, not with noise, but with a stillness that silenced every voice around him. The food before him steamed, untouched by trembling hands, yet he reached calmly, breaking bread with fingers steady, lifting it to his lips as though the act itself were a declaration. He ate slowly, without rush, without need for grandeur. Each quiet movement carried more weight than all their laughter combined. His dignity filled the room, greater than the feast, greater than their false crowns, greater than their stolen pride. Around him they sat, frozen. The son opened his mouth, words stumbling out like broken glass, half apologies, half excuses, but none found footing in the air. The daughter-in-law's lips trembled, her voice low, a plea for forgiveness masked in politeness. The grandson's eyes watered, though no tears fell, his throat choked with the shame of a youth who had mocked what he could never understand. Their apologies stuttered, fragile and unfinished, but he did not need them. He gave no reply, offered no comfort, demanded no penance. His silence was enough, heavier than rebuke, sharper than any accusation, for justice had already spoken. It had spoken in the papers laid upon the table, in the truth that ink preserved when memory failed. It had spoken in the lawyer's steady voice, in the crack of shattering glasses, in the faces drained of pride. It had spoken louder still in the simple act of his hand reclaiming the chair, reclaiming the place they had denied him. There was no need for fury, no need for vengeance. The truth stood alone, undeniable, unerasable. Every wall seemed to echo it. The beams above whispered of the nights he had hammered them into place. The floor beneath remembered the weight of his steps long before theirs. Even the windows reflected his image now, not as a shadow cast aside, but as the master returned. The house itself bore witness, its silence joining his, together heavier than judgment, greater than condemnation. He ate in that silence, and the meal tasted not of food, but of vindication, not triumph, but balance restored. His dignity did not require their words, nor their recognition. It lived within him, unbroken, untouched, shining brighter now that their arrogance had collapsed beneath its weight. They could never erase him. They could never silence him, for tonight had proven what was always true. The man they dismissed was the foundation beneath them, and no betrayal could undo what he had built. And so he sat, calm and steady, eating in silence while the others crumbled around him. The feast was his. The house was his. The legacy was his. And his dignity, greater than any crown, needed no defense. Years passed, and the night of their humiliation became a story whispered in corners, spoken first with shame, later with reverence. Guests who had once sat at that table told it quietly to their children, how arrogance was silenced by a man who said nothing, how truth arrived not with thunder, but with a single hand placed on the back of a chair. What had seemed like a dinner had become a reckoning, and what had felt like an old man's silence had revealed itself as justice clothed in dignity. That night lived on, not because of fury, not because of confrontation, but because it carved into every witness the lesson they would never again dare to forget. Respect, they learned, is not inherited like wealth, or passed down like a surname. It is not claimed by sitting at a chair, nor by raising a glass higher than others. Respect is earned in years of labor, unseen, in sacrifices made without applause, in love given without conditions. It is remembered not by those who boast, but by the walls that still stand, by the roofs that do not fall, by the names inked in deeds that time cannot erase. They had tried to erase him with laughter, but the house itself told the truth. And truth, once spoken, does not die. The son never sat at that chair again without remembering the pale stillness that had overtaken him when the lawyer's voice cut the air. The daughter-in-law never poured wine without recalling how the glass slipped from her hand, her pride spilling with it. The grandson never laughed at age again, for the weight of that shame followed him into manhood, teaching him that mockery is the weapon of the blind. They carried the memory of that night not as triumph, but as a scar etched into their lives, a scar that reminded them of who truly held the foundation of the family. And as years turned into decades, and younger generations entered the house, the story was told again and again, not in bitterness, not in anger, but in reverence. Children who never met him grew up hearing of the man who built with his hands, who endured with his heart, who taught with silence sharper than words. They would walk the halls and hear it said, "This house is not just wood and stone, it is his legacy. Every wall carries his name." And though he no longer sat at the table, his presence never left. His name was etched deeper than ink, deeper than stone, deeper than memory itself. It lived in the respect that could no longer be denied, in the lessons carried forward, in the unspoken weight of truth that turned arrogance into humility. The house, once a battleground of betrayal, became a monument of his endurance. They could decorate it, they could claim it, they could even try to forget, but the foundation would always whisper of the man who built it. And so his legacy endured, untouchable, not in their apologies, not in their belated regrets, but in the permanence of truth. The house was not just shelter. It was the body of his sacrifice, the proof of his worth, the voice of his silence. And no betrayal, no laughter, no arrogance, no erasure could ever take it away. He had taken back the house without warning. But in the end, it was not just the house that was his. It was the story, the lesson, the unerasable truth that respect is not given lightly, and once earned, it lives forever.